Well, Neil Postman is certainly one of my personal heroes, and it's always a treat to be able to talk about what he has to say. I mean, his work was very insightful. He founded the NYU, the New York University School of Media Ecology, um, kind of based on the ideas of his mentor, Marshall McLuhan. And this is called the graduation speech. And it's a very interesting example of it is it's written, but it was also performed by Postman for the graduates at NYU. And I'll just go through it. Uh, Postman says this. He says, "Members of the faculty, parents, guests, and graduates, have no fear. I am well aware that on a day of such high excitement, what you require first and foremost of any speaker is brevity. Brevity means being short and brief. That's what brevity means. Don't talk too long. I shall not fail you in this respect," continues Postman. "There are 5 sentences in my speech, 4 of which you have just heard. It will take me about 12 minutes to speak all of them, and I must tell you that such economy was not easy for me to arrange, because I have chosen as my topic the complex subject of your ancestors. Not, of course, your biological ancestors, about whom I know nothing, but your spiritual ancestors, about whom I know a little." Postman says that, to be specific, I want to tell you about 2 groups of people who lived many years ago, but whose influence is still with us. They were very different from each other, representing opposite values and traditions. I think it is appropriate for you to be reminded of them on this day, because sooner than you know, you must align yourself with the spirit of one or the spirit of the other. The first group lived about 2,500 years ago in the place which we now call Greece, in a city they called Athens. We do not know as much about their origins as we would like, but we do know a great deal about their accomplishments. They were, for example, the first people to develop a complete alphabet, and therefore they became the first truly literate population on Earth. They invented the idea of political democracy, which they practiced with a vigor that put us to shame. They invented what we call philosophy, and they also invented what we call logic and rhetoric. And so he's introducing the Greeks in terms of their values and traditions. And this kind of this idea of the scholarship of the Greeks because of the alphabet and this literacy that developed is very interesting, right? They could write things down on papyrus. And so we are influenced by what they studied. We are influenced by Plato and Aristotle and the Stoics and the Greek playwrights. Neil Postman continues. He says, they came very close, right? The Greeks, the Athenians, they came very close to inventing what we call science. And one of them, Democritus by name, conceived of the atomic theory of matter 2,300 years before it occurred to any modern scientist, right? So think about this, these guys were real geniuses, and all this happened a couple of hundred years before Christ, right? About 300 or so BC. And I mean, like, to put it in perspective, we didn't figure out Ohm's laws that moved into electricity until, the 19th century. Right. The Greeks, composed and sang epic poems of unsurpassed beauty and insight. And they wrote and performed plays that almost 3 millennia later, right, 3,000 years later, still have the power to make audiences laugh and weep. They even invented what today we call the Olympics. And among their values, none stood higher than that in all things one should strive for excellence. They believed in reason, they believed in beauty, they believed in moderation, and they invented the word and the idea which we know today as ecology. And so this idea of a kind of arete, excellence, and this development of logic and reason, which, of course, were the kind of foundation of mathematics and what later became the modern sciences. All right. Uh, Postman says about 2,000 years ago, the vitality or the kind of life force strength of their culture declined and these people began to disappear, but not what they had created. Their imagination, art, politics, literature, and language spread all over the world so that today it's hardly possible to speak on any subject without repeating what some Athenians said on the matter 2,500 years ago. All right, so that's the first group, right? Neil Postman talked about the Athenians. Now he's going to introduce the second group, which, the Visigoths. Postman says the second group of people lived in the place we now call Germany, right? The Gauls, and flourished about 1700 years ago. We call them the Visigoths, and you may remember that your sixth or seventh grade teacher mentioned them. They were spectacularly good horsemen, which is about the only pleasant thing history can say of them. They were marauders, ruthless and brutal. Their language lacked subtlety and depth. Their art was crude and even grotesque. They swept down through Europe, destroying everything in their path, and they overran the Roman Empire. There was nothing a Visigoth liked better than to burn a book, desecrate a building, or smash a work of art. From the Visigoths, we have no poetry, no theater, no logic, no science, no humane politics. Like the Athenians, the Visigoths also disappeared, but not before they had ushered in the period known as the Dark Ages. It took Europe almost 1,000 years to recover from the Visigoths. And so, okay, let's take this whole slide and go at it. I mean, I don't know how fair Postman is really being toward the kind of Visigoths. I mean, you read like some works like Guns, Germs, and Steel, and these modern strategies of warfare were really important in the development of norms in human culture. But what's interesting, right, is they weren't a scholarly people the way the Athenians were. They were a kind of like social Darwinian type of people, very aggressive. I mean, I can think of like on some level the Vikings with like their war gods, and uh so this idea that they were marauders means they were they were war faring people, and they pillaged and they raped and they looted, I think is what Postman here is articulating. They weren't it wasn't a kind of culture that would lend itself ever to peace and harmony. And I think what we would kind of think of as the I don't know the general fruits of happiness, um it wasn't democratic. It was a kind of right makes uh like um might makes right, I should say. And I mean, indeed, I think this is illustrated in a way in Beowulf, right? The classic novel Beowulf, whereby the kind of the king he wins, right, the kind of leader, the tribal chieftain, he wins many battles and he's a great warrior, uh but nonetheless that's kind of all that he is, and that is no way to kind of sustain a culture, right? That's what Postman, I think, is alluding to. And then this last part here about the Dark Ages. I mean, I think you could think about that. These kind of 1,000 years, 9, 10 centuries of the Dark Ages, and that the Visigoths. And it wasn't just the Visigoths, but I think Postman is upset at a lot of the the tribes came and they would destroy the libraries. They'd burn the scrolls, and everything in the past was kind of ripped away, that was written down. And that kind of in a way led to the Dark Ages. If you go to the look at the Middle East, they were great inventors and great scholars, and this idea of kind of the Dark Ages overtaking Europe and a good part of the world, um, had to do with the rise of superstition instead of science. And here you have the kind of uh, the crazy witchcraft and the witch burnings and just um, the relationships between cause and effect are kind of what, substitutions. They're just kind of zany and bizarre, and uh, uh, also often very hostile and nasty. All right. Postman continues. He says, now the point I want to make is that the Athenians and the Visigoths still survive, and they do so through us in the ways in which we conduct our lives. All around us, in this hall, in this community, in our city, there are people whose way of looking at the world reflects the way of the Athenians, and there are people whose way is the way of the Visigoths. I do not mean, of course, that our modern day Athenians roam abstractedly through the streets reciting poetry and philosophy, or that modern day Visigoths are killers. I mean that to be an Athenian or a Visigoth is to organize your life around a set of values. An Athenian is an idea, and a Visigoth is an idea. And let me tell you briefly what these ideas consist of. Postman says to be an Athenian is to hold knowledge, and especially the quest of knowledge, in high esteem. To contemplate, to reason, to experiment, to question. These are, to an Athenian, the most exalted activities a person can perform. So, exalted means like the highest or sacred. To a Visigoth, the quest for knowledge is useless unless it can help you to earn money or gain power over people. And so, I mean, a postman is creating this bifurcation, this separation between, knowledge is a sort of beautiful thing that helps us live a happy life versus knowledge for acquisition and power, right? And he thinks the Athenians are the former and the Visigoths appreciate the latter. All right, here's the second quote. Postman says, to be an Athenian is to cherish language because you believe it to be humankind's most precious gift. And of course, this is related to knowledge, the relation between language and knowledge. In their use of language, Athenians strive for grace, precision, and variety, and they admire those who can achieve such skill. To a Visigoth, one word is as good as another, one sentence indistinguishable from another. A Visigoth's language aspires to nothing higher than the cliche. This is so interesting in modern culture, this idea of grace and precision and beauty and eloquence of language. And to what extent do we as a culture still value these sort of Athenian kind of goals about language? And so this idea of the cliche is super interesting, right? The cliche is, it's borrowed from this. It's French, and what it came from was when like the printers would have a stock or standard phrase when they were actually, they had these kind of metal type plates. The cliche would be a group of words together. That's what a cliche is. That would be used over and over and over again. And so the idea of the Visigoth language aspires to the cliche is the problem with the cliche is that it reduces in a way our mental capacity. It's a sort of shorthand or easy path of least resistance. So you could say things like, do the crime, do the time, and or when I was a kid, they'd say better dead than red, better dead than be a communist, I guess is what it meant. And it's like, you could say those things, and they're cliches because in a way they rip away meaning. They don't give meaning. They're not like maxims or proverbs. They don't lend themselves to further thought. So you could say, like, a proverb might be, a penny saved is a penny earned, or early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. That's Ben Franklin. Or a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. So what does that mean? It means something that's a sure thing is better than a couple of maybes, right? And those are proverbs. Those are not cliches, because not everybody knows what they mean. And they invite a kind of further understanding. All right, here's this third quote. Postman says, to be an Athenian is to understand that the thread which holds civilized society together is thin and vulnerable. Therefore, Athenians place great value on tradition, social restraint, and continuity. To an Athenian, bad manners are acts of violence against the social order. The modern Visigoth cares little, very little about any of this. The Visigoths think of themselves as the center of the universe, right? They're egoists. Tradition exists for their own convenience. Good manners are an affectation, right? It means to pretend, and a burden. And history is merely what is in yesterday's newspaper. And so, like this last quote here is fascinating too, because we're in this kind of civil unrest where people are smashing windows and I mean not just that, there's kind of violence uh, from the police toward the citizenry and back and forth, and there's this great rude vulgar antagonism between the Democrats and the Republicans. And I think the Athenians would be shocked. And the Visigoth, I mean, you could make this argument that we become a very Visigoth-like culture, and that we can't dialogue anymore. We can't with kind of polite care um, in a civilized form just discuss things anymore, and it's terrifying, really. And I think this reading, by Postman is very interesting because it really, he wrote this, I think in 1986 or something like that. So, all right. Postman continues. He says, to be an Athenian is to take an interest in public affairs and the improvement of public behavior. Indeed, the ancient Athenians had a word for people who did not. The word was idiotes, from which we get our word idiot. A modern Visigoth is interested only in his own affairs and has no sense of the meaning of community. Community is an interesting word, it has that Latin com, which means with. It's like how we have to figure out how to live together with each other. That's a community is not a community of the same people. It's very different. People have to get along. And finally, to be an Athenian is to esteem the discipline, skill, and taste that are required to produce enduring art. Oh, I love this. Therefore, in approaching a work of art, Athenians prepare their imagination through learning and experience. To a Visigoth, there is no measure of artistic excellence except popularity. What catches the fancy of the multitude is good. No other standard is respected or even acknowledged by the Visigoth. And so I'll just say a word about this. I mean, I think this idea of enduring art is really critical because, like, for the Athenian, and indeed, I think to what we've lost to a great extent in modern culture is this idea of the past and like the great works of art of the past, and a kind of critical standard. And I think the problem is these, like some of these great works, you think of great novels, they take a lot of time and energy and effort, and they're challenging. And I think the Visigoth doesn't have the stomach for the challenge, so they get annoyed. They say, why does Shakespeare write that way? Why doesn't he write better? Why does he make it easier? Why does he use such big words? All right, here's the third quote. Now it must be obvious what all of this has to do with you. Eventually, like the rest of us, you must be on one side or the other. You must be an Athenian or a Visigoth. Of course, it is much harder to be an Athenian, for you must learn how to be one. You must work at being one, whereas we're all in a way natural-born Visigoths. That is why there are so many more Visigoths than Athenians. And I must tell you that you do not become an Athenian merely by attending school or accumulating academic degrees. My father-in-law was one of the most committed Athenians I've ever known, and he spent his entire adult life working as a dress cutter on 7th Avenue in New York City. On the other hand, I know physicians, lawyers, and engineers who are Visigoths of unmistakable persuasion. And also tell you, as much in sorrow as in shame, that at some of our great universities, right, and as I said, Postman, he taught at NYU, perhaps even this one, there are professors of whom we may fairly say they're closet Visigoths. And yet, you must not doubt for a moment that a school, after all, is essentially an Athenian idea. There is a direct link between the cultural achievement of Athens and what the faculty at this university is all about. I have no difficulty imagining that Plato, Aristotle, or Democritus would be quite at home in our classrooms. A Visigoth would merely scrawl obscenities on the wall. And so, whether you are aware of it or not, the purpose of your having been at this university was to give you a glimpse of the Athenian way, to interest you in the Athenian way. We cannot know on this day how many of you will choose that way and how many will not. You are young, and it is not given to us to see your future. But I will tell you this with which I will close. I can wish for you no higher compliment than that in the future it will be reported that among your graduating class, the Athenians mightily outnumbered the Visigoths. Thank you and congratulations.